we're missing something really big here, which is that even if there is a genetic predisposition, what we've been learning is that it requires environmental exposures to activate those genes, to turn them on.
So if our nervous system is overactivated because we're swimming in this pool of dysfunction, how does that impact our immune system?
How does it impact anything? The nervous system, the immune system, the endocrinology system, it's sort of all of these things are impacted.
Trauma is never the event. Trauma is how it's still living inside your body, right?
It's emotional neglect and emotional abuse stimulate the same wiring of a survival trauma response.
We're pinning a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. All right, so I'm here with Dr. Veronique Mead, and this is a conversation that I have really been so excited to bring to you guys because so many of you listen to the podcast and contact me about things like autoimmune conditions, chronic fatigue, chronic pain. And, this is where we're going to be going today. Dr. Veronique is a former physician turned trauma researcher. So I'd love to just get right into it and ask you, what type of medicine were you practicing and why did you move into becoming a trauma researcher? What was the tipping point for you there?
It's always such a great question because the tipping points that we have can often take years, right, to get there.
Absolutely.
And I was a family doctor teaching in a family practice residency program at the New Hampshire Dartmouth residency program. And it was kind of the career and the job that I had dreamed of forever. I got to teach and I got to work with clients, patients, and it was a process of feeling internally that something wasn't quite right. And it was a number of things that started to add up. Things like feeling that even though medicine has so many miracles that have been developed that can save people's lives, whether it's surgery or medications, the treatments. But I felt as though I was using medications and treatment as Band-Aids for things that were not actually getting addressed. And I would think that a lot of our listeners today, especially if there's an interest in the chronic conditions, a lot of people will have not had the help they were seeking from medications or treatments. And so there was this feeling. It wasn't a clear, conscious thing. It was a feeling. And what I found I really treasured was the relationship I had with my patients and the conversations and what was going on underneath. One of the examples in my last year as this decision was brewing was, for example, treating a child with an ADHD medication, but having a sense that really I was medicating the identified problem or the identified patient, but there were a lot of things going on in the family system, and I didn't understand or know anything about that then, but I've come to learn a lot about that. There's a lot of times where that will happen. The person who's sick is the one who's seen as having a problem, having an issue that needs to be addressed in medicine. But there's often other stuff going on in the family system and multi-generationally and what's happened before. So I didn't know any of these things at the time.
But you sensed it.
I sensed
like you had a sense of something. And I love this for you. This is going to be such a good conversation. I can already tell, because a phrase I use all the time is we're pinning a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Right. And this idea that you're seeing a cluster of symptoms, a cluster of behaviors, a cluster of something that is more symptomatic of what I would call the root. And ADHD is such a great example. And people know I've talked about ADHD so many different times on this podcast, because often ADHD, like many other things, are diagnosed by observing a series of behaviors. Not everybody goes through a neuropsych eval, right? And even when you're going through a neuropsych eval, you're doing a series of behaviors, but those behaviors could be symptoms of something bigger, deeper, having a different root cause, not necessarily a genetic predisposition.
Which is huge because in our current medical culture and in a way, as a result, in our society and our social culture, we've come to really think that chronic illnesses are genetic. If it's physical, it's genetic, and that a lot of symptoms have a genetic base, and that therefore the only way to treat it is medically. And we're missing something really big here, which is that even if there is a genetic predisposition, what we've been learning is that it requires environmental exposures to activate those genes, to turn them on. And those environmental factors are not just toxins or pollution or what you ate. There's a lot of blame that happens, that people are sick because they're not exercising enough. They're lazy. They're sitting on the couch. They're not eating right. They're eating junk foods. There's a lot of blame. But those environmental factors can make a difference, but we're missing the boat for life experiences and the traumas and the stressors and the events and what happens in relationship.
So, how did you start to understand, recognize? Because one of the things I'm thinking of as you're talking, and I'm going to grab it because it's right behind me on my bookshelf, is this book that I read in 2018, I think it was.
Best book ever.
Best book ever. So, for those of you watching on the YouTube channel, you can see it. It's The Deepest Well by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. For those who are listening to the podcast, again, The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke-Harris. She's an MD. The link to the book will be in the show notes. This is what I'm thinking about when you're talking to me about this. You're starting to sense something. How are you starting to connect the dots in your own practice? You know, this is what makes me think of Dr. Burke-Harris, is how she was starting to connect the dots of what she was seeing in her own practice of, is this genetic predisposition? Nobody else in the family has this condition, but yet all the people I'm seeing coming through my clinic are being diagnosed with things like asthma or diabetes or certain different things. And the common denominator wasn't a genetic predisposition, but rather a certain environment that their kids were growing up in. So how did you start to connect those dots?
I think so many of us have come to this place in all these unique ways. For me, I kept feeling that it was important to listen to what my body was saying. I was developing symptoms of fatigue. Fatigue is so nebulous and yet so disabling. I ended up being disabled and mostly bedridden for almost 9 months because the fatigue became so severe about 10 years later. It was a very, very slow process. And a lot of people with chronic conditions will have had that. It's like, oh, there'll be a spike for a few days, it goes away, you don't have it for 3 years, you forget all about it. And this process of the fatigue kind of got me wondering. But in medicine, with my training, with what I knew at the time, I really thought, okay, what we often still assume, I thought, this is just stress related. I'm working 70 plus hours a week. I'm doing 48, 72-hour weekends on call. This is stress. And combining that with my sense that the Band-Aids were not enough, and I was curious about what was going on underneath. And curious for myself, I really wondered, what is my body trying to say? I don't want to ignore it. I don't want to stuff it down with something. I did a few basic labs and they were all normal. My thyroid was fine. My blood sugars were fine. My iron levels were fine. Really basic things we think of as first order in medicine. And so there was something about, and I think this happens for a lot of people with chronic illness, there was something niggling inside wanting to happen that I didn't understand at the time. I ended up taking some time off thinking I'll go back to medicine in a different way that'll work better but I ended up retraining as a somatic psychotherapist, which it was a master's degree program. I'd never heard of this before. And it was a program in psychotherapy, but the somatic focus was the body. And so art therapists work with the unconscious through art, and somatic therapists work with the unconscious through the impulses and the language of the body. So it's getting curious about sensation. It's getting curious about the fatigue. It's getting curious about symptoms. And to answer your question, during those courses, very early in the first semester, I learned about trauma. We don't learn about trauma in medicine. We only really know about trauma as the physical problems that happen, say, from an accident. We don't learn about emotional trauma, and we tend to think, and I felt this way as well, that we really still think that the mind and body are separate. And therefore, anything physical like trauma is in the world of medicine, including chronic illness. It's a physical thing, is how we think about it. It's physical, it's genetic, and it needs physical treatments, as opposed to anything mental health related, like post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, is purely mental, psychological, and that's in the purview of psychiatry and mental health. So we're missing the boat here. What I learned in my training was there's a difference between stress and trauma. And we don't make that connection very easily yet. We talk a lot about stress in medicine. There's more awareness about that. There is more awareness about trauma. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris was California's first Surgeon General.
So good.
Huge change. We can talk about the adverse childhood experiences, which is what
we'll talk about it.
The Deepest Well book is about.
Yes.
When I was learning about trauma, I got very curious. Okay, if trauma can cause symptoms in PTSD that include physical symptoms, physiological symptoms, not just depression or anxiety, but these startle reflexes, high blood pressure, high heart rate that dips to low. These kinds of things are not just in your head. And as I started reading about trauma, I got curious, is trauma a risk factor for chronic illness the way it is for PTSD or mental health conditions? Because it felt as though we were beginning to understand that trauma is a risk factor for PTSD because we can see the link. A traumatic event happens, someone's in combat,
right?
These symptoms. We could see the connection. And that's where I started finding the research. I am not myself a researcher in the sense of doing research studies.
Mm-hmm.
What I've been doing is looking at other people's research and pulling it together for 25 years into what has turned out to be a model for making sense of chronic illness. And it was a series of different these experiences. Like I first read the ACEs research paper. It was first published, the very first ACEs study was published in 1998.
So let's pause there, because I think I want to preface with to the audience, because you and I are going to have now a deep conversation about this. In the 90s, so it was 98 was when the paper was delivered, right? So in the early 90s, the CDC partnered with Kaiser Permanente in California. And just correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe what happened here is they were having every single person who entered a free clinic or an ER setting answer 10 questions. And these questions had nothing to do with their health. Seemingly on the paper, these questions had to do with the environment that you were living in before you were 18 years old. So even if you were not 18 years old and you were 20 or 30 or 80, and you were going into one of these settings, they were asking you just a series of 10 questions. And I won't go through all of them, but some of the questions were, did you ever lose a parent due to abandonment or divorce or death? Or incarceration? Did you ever have a parent that was incarcerated? Did you ever have a parent who had a substance use issue? That's just a handful of the types of questions that were there. And what they were trying to show in their research was that a certain number of what we'll call these adverse childhood experiences could potentially impact your immune system and show up in higher rates of cardiology issues, pulmonary issues, autoimmune issues. Fair? Is that like a fair synopsis?
Since the original study, that's what they've been finding. And just a slight shift, the original study was actually led to the 10 questions. But what they did was they actually asked patients, middle class, coming to Kaiser Permanente for regular appointments of all kinds.
Okay.
17,000 of those folks, they sent a big questionnaire to about their childhood experiences. And from that, they boiled it down to 10.
To the 10. Okay. Which
Yeah.
I feel like now, and we'll talk about this later perhaps, I've been working on my own survey, which was kind of somewhat inspired by, I had already been doing it before I started to see the work that you were doing, where I've kind of created a list of 40 questions, right? Because I just feel like there's quite a bit missing from the ACEs study, but such a great foundation. So we have this sense based on this study that the lived experiences that we have before we're 18 have an impact not just on our mental well-being, but on our physical well-being. And they can put you at risk for higher incidences of very specific types of health challenges, significant health challenges.
Absolutely. And often both. A lot of people will have depression and at least one, if not more, chronic physical conditions. It's really both. And ADHD, to go back to where we started, really symptoms like that in children, and if you go even earlier in babies, like colic or crying a lot or being really fussy eaters, these are actually signs and symptoms of nervous system dysregulation that's happening.
So I think, I think that's a great place to start because, you and I could jam out about this at a very high level all day long, but for the benefit of the listener, I think that's the crux of it that I really want to pause on and talk about. The reason why these adverse childhood experiences, known as ACEs, impact is because when we are going through what I'm going to call complex PTSD or developmental trauma, we are living through a series of chronic, prolonged periods of stress. They do not have to include what I call the 3 A's: abuse, aggression, and acts of violence.
Exactly.
It can be through a mist of dysfunction, truly. But if you are going through a chronic series of experiences during your developmental years that leave you feeling unseen, unheard, insignificant, unimportant, it essentially leads you to feeling not enough, which in your nervous system feels like a threat because we're hardwired for that connection, right?
Yes.
Okay, so if our nervous system is overactivated because we're swimming in this pool of dysfunction, how does that impact our immune system?
How does it impact anything? the nervous system, the immune system, the endocrinology system. It's sort of all of these things are impacted. And this is where we'll come back to stress versus trauma.
Mm.
Stress, the definition of stress, if you read a physiology textbook, it's something that asks your system to adapt. My favorite example is if you're cold, you might start to shiver. That's an adaptive response that can, through the shivering, warm your body. But if you put a coat on and you warm up, you have addressed and adapted to the stressor, and the stressor goes away because you've warmed up and it's done. Trauma is different because it's an experience that our nervous systems, that we experience as, my favorite definition is two things. Something that is you perceive as life-threatening and that's inescapable.
Mm.
The thing is, like your 3 A's, it does not have to be overt to be perceived as life-threatening. And the example of complex PTSD is a really important one because for a child or a baby, not being seen or heard or attuned to, being left to cry it out, which continues in some perspectives today, but a lot of us in a certain age, 40s, 50s, 60s, that was very common when we were growing up. But it's really built on a lack of realization in our health professions that a baby's nervous system is immature at birth and in those first years, and it actually needs the co-regulation of the parent's mature system in order to help it regulate. So a parent who has their own trauma may not be able to attune as well because of their own stuff. And if you realize that, you can work with that. And if you don't, which our culture really misses,
Right.
then you may be, even things like gaze is different, may hold your child less. The child itself, it may be stressful to be around the child because it can be reminders of your own trauma. So that can interfere with how our nervous system learns about the world. This is an environmental experience. And that can lead to dysregulation because for a baby, what I was wanting to get to is for a baby or a child, not having an attuning parent can actually feel life-threatening because
Go ahead.
babies and children, we are completely dependent on the adults, right, for survival.
Yes.
We miss this as health professionals.
It makes me emotional, truly, because God, we didn't know this, first of all, raising our own children, right?
Yeah.
We had this whole cry it out method, the whole thing. There's so much that's coming to my mind. I talk to my clients so often about this fact that we are hardwired for connection.
Yeah.
And I've never read any research to back this up, but this is just the very simplistic view that I give my clients, which is, when we evolved as human beings, thousands of years ago, we moved tribally. We were in community. Everything was a clan or a commune or a collective, a village. And, in isolation, you were endangered.
Exactly.
We would say things like security in numbers. So if you were going to go hunting, if you were going to go gathering, if you were going to go do these things, being in isolation could lead to death because you're at a threat. We don't necessarily have the resources at the time to fight off what the threats would be individually. So even though we as people have evolved, our nervous system hasn't fully caught up yet. So we are that's why I say when we're hardwired in our nervous system for connection, it means that anything that gives us the sense of, and this is that neuroception, right? It's this sense outside of us that we could be on our own or left alone feels very triggering to the nervous system. and this is gets to a whole other thing about belonging and fitting in and the things we do to adapt to feel like we belong because it feels so threatening not to feel like we belong. And that's such a simplistic view of it. But what makes me emotional about it is, part of the work that I do as a trauma specialist is I'm trained as a practitioner in rapid transformational therapy. And what that is a hypnotherapy model that I've then enhanced on my own with all of my trauma training and all of my parts work training. The number of people, when I say I want to go back to a scene, all having to do with whatever it is they're coming to me for, lack of confidence, self-doubt, not believing that they're worthy, not believing that they're enough, which then is causing people pleasing or no boundary setting or perfectionism or all these things that are leading them to unfulfillment and complete burnout in their lives. The number of people that take me back to being in their crib, the number of people that take me back to being in a high chair, which tells me they're likely under 2 years old. I mean, they kind of have a sense when they're under hypnosis how old they are. It's like over 90%.
That's pretty high.
It's almost a guarantee.
Yeah.
That the person's like, I'm in the kitchen, I'm in the high chair, or I'm in my crib, I'm crying, nobody's coming to get me. And I say, and in that moment at 18 months old or 1 year old, what decision did you make in that moment with that information? I'm not enough. I'm not significant. I'm not important. I'm not worthy. There's no concept to the child, mom's in the bathroom, going to the bathroom, or she's running downstairs, putting in laundry. It's not that you don't matter, but that's not the interpretation from the child. And then into your point, they quickly adapt.
Because the adaptation is actually a survival response.
100%. Yeah.
And the survival response, this is where we differentiate stress from trauma.
Okay.
Because trauma, what happens with trauma is that the nervous system gets overwhelmed with this perception, the crying,
fear, yeah,
baby, for example, and there being no adult. There's no escape from that. A baby can't run away. A baby can't fight their way through the crib. And so what the nervous system does automatically through no conscious choice, and especially when we're really young and we're not even thinking yet, the nervous system, to protect us, will shut down and go into freeze.
Right.
Yeah, this is the opossum that does this. This is a physiological response, right? It's not anyone's choice. It's a nervous system response.
It's a survival technique.
Yes, and this is what differentiates stress from trauma. Because when the body goes into a freeze response, the brain does not get the message that it's over. The parent could come into the room, but if this has been happening long enough, whatever long enough is for that child, there's a developing survival pathway in the nervous system that's forming its own perception of whether the world is safe, connecting, supportive or not. Yeah.
Well, and so I always say, and I have this little sign behind me, this black and white sign that says trauma is never the event. Trauma is how it's still living inside your body, right?
Yeah.
And what I'll say to my clients is it's not what happened per se. It's what's still happening. It's the fact that it's still impacting you. And Gabor Mate says it so beautifully. He'll say, and he's not the only one, when the experiences changes the way that you see yourself, others, and the world around you, that's the trauma when it's happening in a limiting way. Right? So it's like putting on a pair of glasses where you're now seeing life through the filter of that unhealed wound. And the wound being, I made this interpretation in that moment of X. I wasn't enough. I didn't matter. I was unsafe. I was helpless. I'll tell you, really interesting. I did a client session yesterday. She was having a problem current day with a particular customer of hers. Okay. She has a service business. She has a particular customer that she's feeling triggered by. And I said to her, I want you to touch into your nervous system and feel where you are sensing that discomfort. And when was the first time you ever felt that? And immediately she said, 9 years old. And I said, okay, and I did a little light hypnosis experience with her. And it took her back to a time. And she really did have, like, I'm going to put in quotes, a bad actor as a parent, meaning there was a parent that did not have her best interest at heart and was doing very abusive things. And she was abandoned, physically abandoned in a very intentional way many times in her life. And one of these episodes came up for her in her memory, and we worked through it and did some light inner child work so we could reconnect with that younger part of herself. And actually, the way I do it is we bring the child out of that environment into the present day. And I have a way that I merge the two together so we don't keep going back, because that's the trauma. We keep going back. We keep living from the sense of that 9-year-old in the woods versus this person in their very much adulthood. And when we can bring these pieces back into the current day and say, we do have more resources now. I can't feel trapped if I find myself in that situation again, because I have access to things. I can get up and move. I can walk out and ask for help. I can do these things. So to your point, it's that feeling trapped and helpless and powerless that so often is the trauma that separates it from just being a general stress, which I think more people walk with than they realize because they assume it has to be the 3 A's.
Yes, and it's emotional neglect and emotional abuse stimulate the same wiring of a survival trauma response as does physical abuse or combat, for example. All of those.
Okay, so let's assume someone's listening and they're going, oh shit. Like, I know what my childhood was, and da 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 da. And by the way, I was just diagnosed with fibromyalgia, lupus, Sjogren's, Hashimoto's, rheumatoid arthritis. Like, we could just list the names on and on and on, but their doctor's not saying anything to them about trauma. I actually have a client right now that's saying to me, what resources can I give my doctor? How can I get my doctor back on the same page? Because I've had my client read this, right? The Deepest Well. How do you close the gap when we know a large percentage of our medical field is not yet being trained in this?
Really good question. Well, first, knowing with the example you just gave of therapy, that the trauma response is really intelligent. We go into freeze,
Totally.
like the bear goes into hibernation, to wait until there's an opportunity to do what you need to do, to emerge into spring, to wait until winter's over, to get the kind of support, say through trauma therapy of all different kinds of therapy. Repair by getting the signal back to the brain that, oh, it is over. Oh, I am not trapped. And the somatic component can make a really big difference in this. So first of all, knowing that, yes, we can actually heal trauma. It can take time. Can we heal it all completely? I don't know, but we can heal trauma. And so one of the things I did with my blog is called Chronic Illness Trauma Studies, where I share the research. And I created fact sheets. So it's kind of in a doctor's language, in the sense that you have one page that has, for an ACEs fact sheet, the one page summarizes the science. It then lists what the 10 ACEs are, and it lists what the science has found about how ACEs are a known risk factor for autoimmune diseases, the ones that you mentioned. But fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, those are a little harder to tell, but there's still some research on that. So it lists those, and then it lists the kind of resources. And on the back, if you were to print that as a two-sided page, are all the references that come from medical research that can help a doctor kind of see, okay, there's actually a lot of evidence for this. And so,
Okay.
yeah,
Repeat the name of the this will be in the show notes, but this is so important because I've been to your website many times. Sometimes I'm just trolling through there like a rabbit going down a hole because the content is so good.
there's a lot of content at this
There's
point.
so much content, but it's
Yeah,
so good. And I'm just so obsessed with providing my clients with resources that will let them feel more powerful, have more agency, not feel so helpless and feel hopeful because
yeah,
that's part of the healing.
yeah.
Just say the name of the site again. I will put it in the show notes, but I just want you to say it again.
Yeah, it's chronic illness, trauma studies.com. It's a bit long, but I wanted it to say what it does. It's about
Yes. And so
research.
people can go and print up these one pagers and provide them to their doctors, correct?
Yes, they're free. If you look
I
in
love
the
it.
menu, they're under the menu header called Tools and Fact Sheets. There's one for ACEs, there's one for events in babyhood, there's one for people who have autoimmune diseases, showing the research there. They're all free, they're all downloadable as PDFs. And yes, it's really about this empowered place. You may or may not be able to change your doctor's mind. You may be the first or second person who plants a seed, and maybe 15 people later they'll start. You don't know that, but that's one thing you can do. We do, I think, need to change medical education, and that is beginning to happen in some places. And it can be hard to find the kind of physician who communicates. I think this is the biggest missing thing in medicine. And it's not all the doctor's fault. The way the system is now,
Right.
doctors have so little time. They're given 15 minutes for new patient evaluations with people with complex chronic conditions. It's very, very difficult. But really, what I hear over and over again from people who write in on the blog and people I've had conversations with is if someone can be believed, if when you as a patient with a symptom see a health professional and they believe you,
Huge.
it's huge, 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 huge. Because a lot of what doctors don't realize is happening is that people are having a reenactment of that complex PTSD, of those early relationship misses, which most people with chronic illness have had. I have surveys on my blog. I started them a year ago, and this has been actually, I started some of them probably 6 or 8 years ago. One of them was the ACEs study. And what I was really surprised to find was the two most common ACEs on people on my blog for people who are taking the ACE 10 ACEs questionnaire on my blog are the complex PTSD. The two most common ACEs, 70% of people, most of whom have a chronic illness or a mental health condition or both, are emotional neglect
Yeah.
or emotional psychological abuse. I was really shocked by that. The Kaiser Permanente original study, it was 11% of people. So when people go to their physicians, they're going to someone who they need a relationship with, who many times we are dependent on this hierarchical relationship for them to help with problems that can be very serious. And when that person doesn't believe them, it's actually traumatizing. It's
It
really,
really is.
really difficult. And so, if a doctor did nothing else than to believe, even if they don't know what to do, they don't know what to say, they don't know what to recommend, it's for many people, if their doctor believes them, they get to start in that place that actually offers a sense of safety, relationship, connection.
I, my mind is running at 1,000 miles an hour because one of the things I'm writing down here is the title for this episode should be the episode that every medical professional should listen to. Because, we can't wait until the beast of a system, which is
That's right.
medical school,
That's right.
gets their shit together. I feel the same way about, people who are getting degrees in psychology
Yeah.
and they're becoming psychotherapists or psychoanalysts, and they've never been trained in trauma. It's no
Yeah.
different than listening to Dr. Mary Claire Haver, who's now like on the forefront of menopause, saying in her OBGYN, rounds, she got 6 hours on menopause.
Right.
Like there's just this missing loop. There's this missing gap. And I have a lot of friends that are therapists, psychoanalysts, psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and they were never trained in trauma. And they say things like, not they don't say this to me, but I'll be in a networking situation where I'll be meeting somebody that's been practicing for 30 years and they say, "Oh, I hear you deal with trauma." And I say, "Yes, I do." And they go, "Oh, I don't do with any of that." And in my head, I'm like, "Oh my God, that's all you're dealing with."
Yeah.
And so there's this gap and
Yeah.
it's not their fault.
Yeah.
And if they're not getting exposed to, like you said, one of your steps into this was your own chronic fatigue. I was diagnosed with seronegative rheumatoid arthritis when I was 48 years old. So what does that mean, seronegative? It means I had every symptom of it other than the rheumatoid, marker. My C-reactive protein was off the charts. Every single joint had this pain in it I couldn't fully describe. And my fatigue, I would say to my husband, "I'm fatigued." And he'd say, "Oh, you're tired." I'm like, "Oh, no. Tired is when you haven't had enough sleep."
Yeah.
Fatigue for me, the only way I could describe it, first I would say to him, "I feel like I'm coming out of anesthesia all day long." And then the only other way I could describe it was, imagine if every single cell in your body is filled with energy at its optimal output and it's like a grape, like really full. Imagine every single one of those cells is a raisin. It's just completely depleted of energy. I just walked a half marathon. When I was sick, quote unquote, when my body was failing me, I could walk a mile and then have to sleep 3 hours. Like I couldn't function. And when I got diagnosed, finally, there was a part of me that was relieved that there was a name and a diagnosis and that someone, quote unquote, believed me,
Yeah.
that I felt so horrible and that my numbers showed it. But it's important for people to hear my numbers showed it because my body was shifting and changing. I know my ACEs score. I've been studying ACEs for a long time. Depending on what test you take, I'm like a 5 out of 10. Okay. A 4 or 5 out of 10, depending, because they've shifted over the years. I said to my doctor, she wanted me to take a steroid. And I said, before we go down there, I don't want to put, to the beginning of this conversation, a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. I know intuitively, just like you knew intuitively, you were seeing things in your practice. I said, I know intuitively there is a level of inflammation in my system for a variety of reasons that is causing these numbers to be off the charts. And I would like to take a different approach that's non-medical. Not that I'm against medicine at all. I'm not. But for me personally, I didn't want that Band-Aid on the bullet wound. I wanted to heal my bullet wound. So she said, okay.
And while you're at it.
And I said, listen, get the bullet out. I said, my ACEs score is a 5. And she just looked at me and I said, are you familiar? Now remember, this is a rheumatologist. I said, are you familiar at all with the ACEs study? And she's like, I've heard about it once. I don't know, not really. And she's young, by the way. She's got to be in her 30s. So she's a relatively new medical, professional. I ended up, my personal way of doing this, which my, audience has heard before, is I did like 3 months of very, very intensive acupuncture, lots of cupping, but I just had some like epiphanies on the table that were more emotional for me than anything. And once I had the awareness and the realization of things, the parts of me that were all clenched up could release. It was almost like my body's like, oh, you've heard me, you get it. And I could then start giving back to my body the things it didn't get. during traumatic times.
And that says so much, Stacy, because it's not just one kind of approach. It's not just a specific kind of trauma therapy or even therapy. The fact that these shifts could happen during acupuncture, for some people it's craniosacral work,
Oh,
for
yeah.
others it's yoga, for others it's energy medicine. That's part of this empowered journey where, okay, you can try and work on educating your doctor, but they're not your only person to work with.
Mm,
There are others who get it or who get it enough. And this is really a process of what are you drawn to? What resonates for you? And that's a clue from your system, from your body of what might be a fit for you. So that, for some people, they don't want to deal with acupuncture and needles. Not in a
yeah,
million,
no doubt.
no problem. There are other approaches. And so you mentioned your ACE score of 5, 4 or 5 out of 10. We think of the number 10 and how, well, 4 or 5 isn't that bad. 4 or 5 is huge.
Yeah,
And even an ACE score of 2,
right.
2 meaning that let's say your mother had postpartum depression and that your parents got divorced. Very, very, very common. But an ACE score of 2 is associated with a 70% higher chance of having an autoimmune illness.
Yeah.
That's shocking,
And what
really.
we're really saying is, even at a 2, our nervous system gets dysregulated enough that it disrupts our immunity.
And I'm going to go another step. My ACE score is really maybe a 0 or a 1. When I first read that ACE study, it was in maybe 2005. It had already been out for 7, 8 years. There were a couple things that happen for people that I hear all the time. Well, my illness is not something they studied, therefore it does not apply to me.
Mm,
Or my ACE score is 0 or 1, therefore I didn't have any trauma, therefore trauma is not a risk factor. And that's when we come back. And it took me some years to find this, but ultimately we come back to what I think of as missing ACEs, like what you
yeah,
said. Your questionnaire has 40 questions on it.
yeah.
I started off with my questionnaire had 70, and now it's with people's input. There's 107 on my ACEs Plus survey.
Mm.
But that's just one survey. I have a separate survey that's the complex PTSD survey.
Can you talk about that a little bit? And I wanted, this is a good lead segue because, again, I talk about these things all the time, but we might have a new listener. So what is the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD?
I would say, in a nutshell, a way of thinking of PTSD is it may be a single event type
Yeah,
of thing, such as what a combat veteran experienced, except that combat veterans will not have just had one experience, but there may have been one final event. That may be a classic way of thinking about PTSD. When the person has the flashbacks or the nightmares, they relate to a very specific single event,
right.
perhaps. I think even that's going to be much more complex because we find out that those who develop PTSD, veterans who develop PTSD, had more adverse events in childhood.
Well, I was at one of Bessel van der Kolk's conferences a few years ago. It was the Trauma Research Foundation. They do a conference every year, and I went into one of his talks, and I don't remember the exact number, but the ACEs score that the majority of people who enlist in the services is very high.
Wow. So there's already potentially a starting point.
It's kind of right. So like when you look at like people who are incarcerated, which is a whole other thing, for me, just from a compassionate point of view, because so many people who are incarcerated have very high ACEs scores.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and there's a variety of reasons for that. There's also a correlation that there have been studies to show that people who enlist also have very high ACEs scores. So I'm going to put in quotes, predisposition, not to say that an acute trauma event isn't going to impact everyone, but perhaps on a scale of severity, of PTSD, perhaps somebody that already went into the service with a higher ACEs score, their nervous system was dysregulated enough that it was going to have a deeper impact, maybe.
Well, they do show that these are the veterans who develop more severe PTSD with a younger age of onset, are the ones who had earlier experiences. And you were asking about the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD. And complex PTSD is more of a longer term exposure, which, when you think about it, that can absolutely happen in combat. You're
Yeah.
not out there for one event, they're out there for months or years or recurring.
Do you think complex PTSD needs to occur during someone's developmental years?
That's the other place where complex PTSD is essentially, that's what we think of as developmental trauma, developmental wounding, attachment trauma. And that is really huge because during our formative years, when our nervous system and the neurons and everything is actually wiring, and we even know, even in the well, I say even, we would say that in our culture. Oh, even in this. But what we know from the research is there's so much developmental stuff happening during pregnancy. Your brain, your neurons, you've got the most neurons you're ever going to have in your entire life. And then they start getting pruned away as you develop, as your system starts to orient towards what direction are you going in, a sense of safety, a sense of stress perception.
Right.
So these early years, the first 3 years, there's the most stuff going on then. But our brains are still developing beyond our teenage years. And so to think of a child growing up in a family system for 18 years, maybe it's 15, maybe it's 25, that's a very long exposure to a very particular set of behaviors and patterns that may be really missing attunement.
So I have two thoughts here. I think the attachment piece is absolutely critical.
I agree.
For people to understand. I have a lot of people who listen to my podcast who are parents of children who are adopted. And those adoptees might now be teenagers or even adults themselves. Perhaps they're younger. My children are adopted. So I've been in this space for a long time, my entire parenting period of time. You know, when you're adopting, at least from my experience, there was no conversation from the agency, from the social worker, from anyone about attachment or anything having to do with the experience the child was having prior to coming in.
Yeah.
I've even worked with adults now who had, I'm going to put in quotes, a failed foster situation because the agency that placed the child with them never talked about the word trauma, never gave any sense of what they could be walking into. Yeah. But there's no way that a child that's being removed from their family of origin is not experiencing a trauma. Yeah. And so they're giving this child to these families with absolutely no education on what's going on. And then the families are ill prepared for the behaviors that they're going to see, not even just the physiological things that they're going to see. Absolutely. Right. So am I remembering correctly that because I know you've put together so many batteries of surveys on your website, was one of them either attachment related or adoption related? I can't remember.
There's one that's attachment related that is about the relationships with the parents and what those experiences were like. There's a separate one that goes up until your third birthday. And that's a babyhood one. That's because the experiences that happen to your mother when she was pregnant with you, to your father when they were getting together, that happened to your family system, that happened during labor or your birth, if you were in an incubator, if your mom was sick, if a family member died in those first 3 years, it has a much bigger impact than at other times.
And I think so there's two things I want to address. A, there are some people that don't have access to any of that information,
Right. Yeah.
right? Especially if they were adopted, say, after 2, 3, 4 years old.
Mhm.
But also, oh, the idea that, and I think you'll probably speak more eloquently to this, but the concept, because neuroplasticity and the rate at which everything's developing is so rapid between that 0 to 2, 0 to 3 time frame, one of the things that I had been exposed to is this idea that if things were really challenging and there was a tremendous amount of chronic prolonged stress between the ages of, say, birth and 2 or 3, but everything from 3 to 12 was a little bit, I'm going to say, simpler. It's more impactful in that short period of time than if everything was great 0 to 2, but everything was a shit show 2 to 12. Is that fair?
That does seem to be what the research is showing.
Yeah.
And the whole question about adoption, it's such a poignant one because these children who were, say, somewhere abroad where they were in an orphanage for 1, 2, or 3 years before being adopted, where they may have been really terribly neglected and left in a crib with rails and only fed and only seen during feeding times, there is really a lot that hasn't been taught to
Right.
adopting.
And I'll say, my experience was with South Korea. And of course, one of the reasons why I chose South Korea, or my husband and I chose South Korea when we were looking at all the countries to adopt from, the states included, was that they were in foster care. They weren't in orphanages. And I know a lot of people that listen to this podcast have children from South Korea. But what was lost on me in that process was, in their system, the way it was in the early 2000s was you were removed from your mother at birth, placed with a foster family, and then when you were matched, you were then placed with another foster family if you were not born in Seoul.
Wow.
So if you were born in Seoul, you could stay with your foster family. But if you were not born in Seoul, you were then, so now you're having a second disruption. I want people to think of a rupture or disruption. Your first connection is ruptured and disrupted. You're going into a foster family. We can only assume that the needs were being met by the child appropriately, or the child's needs were being met appropriately in that first foster setting. They're then removed again, let's just say around 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks old, depending, put into another one in Seoul. And the reason why they're doing that is because that's where the embassy is. And now that these kids have been matched, they need to get their passports and they need to get a visa and they need to go through a lot of processing and they need to be where that processing is done. And then they're given to another stranger, right? Either someone who is escorting the child to the States or this new family. Either way, it's a stranger. So in best case scenario, you've had 3 ruptures by the time you're somewhere between 6 and 9 months old.
It's a lot.
That's a lot.
It's
and
a lot.
again, I think it's so important for especially the families that I know that listen to this who have gone through the adoption process. Even if the foster settings were fantastic, the adaptation, this is the important thing. Your child is having to constantly adapt with, where am I and who are these people and am I safe? Even if their needs are being met. Their nervous system is not designed. They don't know what the plan is.
Yeah.
They don't know this is a process. This is a system. All they know is I'm trying to co-regulate. I'm trying to create a bond. I'm trying to attune ruptured. I'm trying to do it done. It's very possible by the second time they go like this, I'm out. Freeze or appease. And how are you really appeasing other than probably being quiet? So they're learning the survival strategy, brilliant, of coping with a very stressful thing on a very young nervous system that, by the way, if it works and it clicks, is the same coping strategies they're using when they're 10, 12, 13, 14 years old, and they're learning how to navigate with all the things in adolescence and all the other things going on in their life. It's just a hardwired thing that gets rooted into their nervous system because it worked. So that feels predictable. It feels safe. It feels consistent. So I just know that there's a lot of families in that space who struggle because their kid is stuck and they've never been educated on this. And unfortunately, because of the way the DSM-5 is set up, and complex PTSD is not in the DSM-5 and developmental trauma is not in the DSM-5, they end up getting this whole host of diagnoses: ADHD, OCD, obstinate defiance disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, dissociative depressive disorder. And then they're treated for that, which again is the Band-Aid on the bullet wound.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see where I'm going with that?
Oh, we know where you're going with that. I mean, really what we're talking about is the nervous system dysregulation,
right,
of a system that's in a survival response.
And it being pathologized, which is what makes me so crazy.
Yes, exactly. Because once we do understand that this is actually coming from a very intelligent, adaptive response of survival, then all these tools are available for
That's
the
right.
parents. And up to a certain age, the parent can actually get trauma therapy.
No doubt.
That then can help them bond even more fully because they also had this experience of what we think of as separation. And so with the parent, with the baby, with the whole unit getting treated from these trauma perspectives, hypnosis, EMDR, trauma therapy, there's bonding therapy. There's a lot of approaches that can actually work with this once we understand what actually is underlying and driving the symptoms, that's the hopeful part as we learn more and understand this much better than when you were adopting in the past and having people who haven't been educated in this way.
Amen. So as we wrap up, what is, one takeaway that you would love for the audience to walk away with?
Only one takeaway. Well, I think I would start by saying that a lot of people who have symptoms know there's something going on. And allow yourself to believe that. And there is a part that's going to make us want to keep going and going and going and see 18 and 20 and 25 doctors over the years. That's one pathway, and it's hard to know when to stop because some people find something that then fixes it, right? But if you've got a sense internally about anything that we've been talking about today, if there's anything that resonates with you and you've had trouble getting it figured out, getting a name for it, a diagnosis for it, a treatment, maybe you've spent $10,000 or $100,000 and nothing has worked, then I'd say my one takeaway is keep listening and follow that to trying something that's probably going to be a little out of your wheelhouse. But there's so much information now online, out in the world about everything we've been talking about. There's less of it in the role specifically of chronic physical illnesses. And that's why I created this blog. So my blog has a wealth of resources with links to go to all kinds of places, but you can find really good information, really good books. If you learn better through podcasts like this, there are all kinds of additional podcasts with information, and that can take you down one step at a time on how for you, what might work for you to chip away at this and start looking at your symptoms, your experiences from this different perspective. The perspective alone, I use it all the time with my own symptoms, is really empowering because it really helps you see how there are things you can do. And with that, I can end with, on my homepage of my blog, I have a free downloadable PDF, and it's 16 tools. These tools have research behind them. Most of them, many of them are free things you can do yourself. Some take more willpower than others, but every one of these, including diet and exercise, but remembering to include the trauma piece, can actually really make a difference with chronic illness and other kinds of symptoms.
I literally could talk to you for hours. It's hard for me to find people who I can fully jam out with on this. And I'm so deeply passionate about people getting educated on this because I do believe so strongly that awareness is key. The
That's why I
first
smiled when you were here talking about trauma and jamming out, is that there's a
There's so
wealth
much.
of
But
information.
your website, and guys, I spend a lot of time reading, a lot of time diving deep. Veronique's website, the best website you can go to, truly, because you've culminated and the surveys that you've created have been just so amazing. The research is so amazing that if anyone's listening to this and this sparked, her website URL will be right in the show notes. I highly, highly recommend you go there and look at her research, look at her surveys, download these PDFs, bring them to your doctors. I mean, she's really doing a lot of important work to help you start off on your journey. So this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful for your time. For people who don't know, we were supposed to start a half hour earlier than we did. And I was so deep in other work. And for some reason, I had my timing off in my head. So I was just so happy that you stuck with me and hung out in my room here. So thank you so much, truly, for having the time and making the time to come on to this podcast, because I know for sure this conversation is going to resonate with a lot of people. There's just too many people walking around with either undiagnosable conditions or autoimmune. Many people have multiple autoimmune conditions. And if that's the case, listen to this, use this, go to Dr. Mead's site, download some of these PDFs, bring them to your multiple doctors. And just because they listen or they don't listen, this is going to all be about becoming your best knowledge and your own advocate at the end of the day, because you know your body best and you know your lived experience best. So thank you so much. It has been such an honor having you on. And guys, again, all of the information will be in the show notes. We really appreciate having you.
Thanks for having me, Stacy.